Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Gannon, and I bid you all welcome finally to my Gothic playable teaser critique that I promised for the past week at least. THQ Nordic decided to drop this bomb on us without very much notice indeed, and seems like I'm the last person to really get my thoughts out there. Did stream this last week, and it was a night of very intense emotions and a lot of drinking, and so that live stream, while it's available to watch, does not really stand as a very well thought out or elaborated critique of the game, which is what I want to offer here today. And boy, do I have a lot of notes to cover. So to summarize, this Gothic playable teaser, as it's being called, is in development, published by THQ Nordic, and entrusted to a new development studio they have founded called THQ Nordic Barcelona. This being a brand new studio, we know very little about who they are, who works for them, and what sort of projects any of them have worked with in the past. This seems to be a very fledgling effort which is being promoted by THQ Nordic as a sort of litmus test to gauge player interest in the franchise being reboot and determine if it should be taken in different directions or the idea scrapped altogether. So today we're going to take a very long look, going over all the details I could bear to write down about this demo, to pour over this demo as analytically as possible and come to a conclusion on what this reboot can do to satisfy that nostalgic feeling in all of our hearts. So I say we start with probably the first thing you gotta notice, which is the visuals. What we have on display here is definitely indicative of a work in progress. We have a mishmash of texture quality in general. In fact, you can walk from one rock to another and really see the difference. In terms of the character models, the character features typically are really weirdly ugly, wrinkly, and made to look filthy and lacking distinction, which is made worse by a lot of the Unreal post effects that we'll talk about in a little bit. Characters like Diego in particular seem to have this really weird splotchy complexion, and the wrinkles look like they were done by a second-rate makeup artist to try and make them look older. It's almost as though the textures don't have enough resolution for the amount of detail they tried to add to the characters. I'm not really sure how to explain what I mean by that. I am a fan in general that the characters all seem to have different heights and physiques to each other, which is something that Piranha Bytes has never really attempted, and in my opinion always made their characters look a lot less distinctive from each other, especially in the later games where they had a tendency to reuse character models a lot more. The solitary orc that we see in the intro looks absolutely horrendous, and I do not like this weird zombie alien appearance that he's got going on, and very generic at that. I prefer the more furry, goofy-looking, ape-like R.A. Salvatore type orcs that we had in the original games, not these really generic monster-looking type. It seems like this demo really just went hard on the stock Unreal 4 post effects, and they clash with the environment and a lot of the textures in general. It doesn't seem like they were really implemented with any real thought. There's this intrusive fog over everything, a weird blue filter that seems to come with the fog that makes the environment look snowy when it's not, and it really mutes the color diversity in the environment in a really unfortunate way. There's these blinding bloom effects on all light sources, especially in the intro when there's a shit ton of fire everywhere, and for some reason a really gaudy light lens flare effect on the torch. The smoke and heat effects on the fires throughout the game just have this weird grainy filter over the environment rather than a realistic ripple or distortion effect that you would see in real life. Nighttime itself is made outrageously brighter with the post effects maxed out. Not really sure why that is. It makes it less believable how the nameless hero doesn't see corpses right in front of him when they're visible for miles around when you have the post-processing maxed out. In fact, I would argue the game looks much better with the post-processing turned off, simply because nighttime is believably dark. In general, I find the environment is pretty richly detailed. There's a variety of foliage. You walk around, there's a lot of grass, a lot of lavender, a lot of different flowers and stuff. Although the fade-in on this foliage is pretty intense, even on high settings. There's a lot of detail on the rocky faces that I enjoy, such as trees and roots and ivy and moss growing everywhere. I really enjoy the variety of assets they have in general, especially across the exchange place, such as numerous crates, barrels, wagons, cranes, and all those types of structures. The locations of some of these structures don't seem to make much sense, but I like that they're not just copying and pasting the same one or two art assets for each type of structure or crate or anything like that. They really seem to diversify it quite a bit. Not really sure why the developers seem to think the bodies can just burn to a crisp before dropping dead and getting stuck like these charcoal statues that they put not only in the opening area but in the intro as well, which is really bizarre. Not sure why, but in like a lot of dialogues and a lot of the exploration, there was this strange film grain effect that seemed to show up over the grass, over characters' faces, over stuff like the wolf furs. And I'm not really sure why that was the case. I couldn't really find an occasion where it happened predictably. In general, I think the reflective surfaces and puddles and stuff like that works pretty well, but it also seems to have this bizarre blue outline that kind of may be the same cause as a blue filter that we get over a lot of the textures in the environment. Probably the most unfortunate visual aspect of this demo is the really bog standard UI. It almost seems like it was some kind of stock Unreal 4 UI that they used, and there's definitely things like very modern text, very modern fonts used in a lot of ways that just seem like they're stock placeholder ones that are hopefully intended to be replaced. The in-game menu looks like it's torn between trying to look really sleek and clean or weathered in sort of medieval fantasy kind of look. It's really weird seeing the clean modern fonts over the general aesthetic, but again, all this might just be placeholders. Overall, it seems like the environment can really just be described as Skyrim, but with more color, with really rocky environments, very temperate color schemes, but a lot more diversity in terms of sort of colorful foliage and that sort of thing. I will say the lushness of the environment does not really harken to Gothic's more bleak and drier looking environment, although some of the bleakness of the original game might have been down simply to technical limitations of the time. So we saw a lot more detail in Gothic 2 when that came out, but it was still pretty distinctive in its own right. Not to really rag on this game for it, because I do think the amount of detail is definitely noteworthy. There is a lot of visual interest in the environment with things like flying birds and swarms of bugs and stuff, although I gotta say a lot of this is a lot less immersive when you see crows flying in and out of rocks and stone walls and stuff like that. In terms of monster designs, I'm really not a fan of the design of the snappers and scavengers this time around. For some reason, both of them look really reptilian. And I'd say the scavengers themselves actually look more like the original snappers rather than large prehistoric kind of birds. And the snappers themselves look more alien than prehistoric like in the original, with all these weird sharp bits and horns and stuff that they just didn't have the first time around. And in general, there's just a lot of details that reduce the similarities to the atmosphere of the original game. For better or for worse, whatever you really think. Clothing in general seems more fantasy rather than the sort of simple, practical, rustic kind of outfits that the characters had in the first game. Diego in particular has this weird sort of minstrel outfit that I guess suits his personality this time around, which we'll get to, but really does not seem like a practical suit of armor as he wore in the first game. And the nameless hero also is wearing a strange tunic that almost seems to resemble a hybrid of his default outfit in Gothic 3 and Forsaken Gods, with some extra straps and butt flaps for some reason. In general, the armor that we see so far looks more realistic and practical than the weird collars and shoulder pads and stuff of the classic old camp guard armor. The basic guard armor still has some callbacks to that design with the red cloth and the black studded collar and stuff like that. I will say Bloodwind's armor looks even more ridiculous than the heavy guard armor of the original game with the weird demonic flares on it, but it is certainly distinctive. The ore itself looks more like generic crystals in this game rather than the familiar sort of purple streak stone that we all were fond of collecting in the first game. And in fact, when you really become pedantic with it, the word ore in a geological term basically just means metal that's embedded in a stone, not the metal itself. So it was already an error in the original. I don't know why they had to make it worse by making them look like crystals instead. When we get to animations, I must say that's one of the weaker parts of this. Not to say that the original Gothic or really any Piranha Bytes games are going to win awards in that regard, but it's been almost 20 years. I think you can do a little bit better. The in-game cutscenes really seem to fall prey to the problems that occur a lot with lower budget games that try to go for this sort of cinematic approach. There's typically really bad motion capture that make the movements look outrageously clumsy and sluggish. Objects that characters are holding don't seem to move in the same frames they do, so we get situations where a character's shaking a torch or a scroll or something around, and it just seems to leave his hand constantly. It's almost like these objects were not animated in the same frames as the character animations were. The actual opening of the game with a very classic narration was probably the worst part about it, but all of this seems to be pretty much a placeholder, since none of it really looks like it's finished. Hopefully it is a placeholder, because it all looks pretty terrible, to be honest. The lack of environmental features, this weird, like, grayscale, pitch black kind of appearance, weird camera pans, and this bizarre first-person perspective on the mage's hands. And the intro itself seemed to use in-game rendering to perform the cutscene, since there were some inconsistent bugs that I found with it, such as when Robar knocks some stuff off the table. In one playthrough, I found that all that stuff just reappeared as soon as he knocked it off. When we get past the ridiculous Hollywood explosion in the intro, there's a weird bug where I would see parts of the exploding lift structure reappear in the sky after you reload the game. All stuff that was supposed to have fallen into the water afterwards. Really egregious oversight in that regard. It's really bizarre if you watch the idle NPCs. They don't seem to blink or really do much other than standing still, just breathing with their eyes occasionally darting around. In some cases, even in dialogue, some facial animations seem to be missing, particularly in the sequence where the hero's walking and talking with Diego. Neither of their lips seem to move or anything. I did enjoy some of the in-game interactions and the animations that came along with it, such as pulling the sword out from the charred corpse, which adds some immersive qualities that we don't seem to get a whole lot of with Piranha Bytes games nowadays. Although I must say, the Nameless Hero really should have seen a doctor before he got incarcerated. His stream looks weak and really unhealthy. I do enjoy that there are some more unique animations in the dialogues, since they actually seem handmade for the conversations in a lot of ways, as opposed to the old school and even modern Piranha Bytes games where they seem kind of random, and a lot of the gestures don't really mesh with the actual dialogue spoken by the characters. None of the characters really seem to move from their home positions unless they're scripted to, and don't really perform anything other than static animations or typically just standing there idle until scripted to or otherwise made hostile. One of the more annoying parts of dialogue is how the conversations sometimes force the camera into weird perspectives and give odd focus on characters or objects, such as the first dialogue we have with Diego, which was really weird. We were forced into a first-person perspective with the hero just sitting completely still, but constantly like waving his hands around in ways that nobody would do if they were talking. Like, just imagine you having a conversation with somebody and they're gesturing in front of their own face this whole time. It was pretty neat how Diego actually moved around and interacted with things in the environment, even if it was just scripted, but it would be nice to see this kind of detail in more ordinary conversations. Since Piranha Bytes games, typically all conversations tend to result in characters just dropping their activities immediately, standing upright in all dialogues, even with Risen being a step forward in that regard. Probably comes as no surprise, but this demo was riddled with a lot of performance problems, a lot of technical issues that, quite frankly, I'm kind of astounded that they would release it in this state if they expected it to impress anybody. There are a lot of really slow texture loading issues every time you load or launch a new game, or even when rotating the camera sometimes, which I found do tend to be common with lower budget games built on the Unreal Engine. Seen it pretty frequently in games like Chivalry and Mordhau. There's some really annoying bugs with cloth physics that seem to especially occur during dialogue every time the camera perspective changes. You see it quite often in games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, for reasons I don't really know, but it seems especially bad here. There were cases where pieces of a character's outfit would get stuck like up in their crotch and weird things. So you're just sitting there watching Caden, for example, get a really bad wedgie with his skirt for some reason. I do enjoy the details on things such as how NPCs like Bloodwood and Heavy Armor make little metallic sounds every time they move or make gestures without it being too noisy and ridiculous. And also the way Bloodwind's voice was realistically muffled by his helmet that he was wearing. There are a lot of stability issues with this game. Menus often froze when you open them, such as when saving or opening the quick radial menu. I discovered a really predictable bug where if you just keep tapping E to talk with a character, the screen would keep fading to black over and over again every time you press the button, and then once it entered the conversation, it had a habit of freezing with a character standing in place with no dialogue options or any way to exit the dialogue. The camera really seemed to have a lot of collision problems with the environment, which caused some really horrible visibility issues, which were especially annoying in combat. Any occasion where you backed up into a wall and then suddenly couldn't see through your own legs to see the characters attacking you. And on that note, the shaky camera in the combat is outrageously distracting, and the HUD follows the character models when it happens, so it's very annoying to try and follow and keep your eyes on the prompts and on your health bar and everything as it's shaking around. A lot of the prompts to interact with objects in the environment don't seem to appear until you're basically standing on top of them, and it's really annoying because the character needs to be facing the object, and trying to turn and face them often results in him just stepping over it instead. Trying to loot bodies and step on meat bugs while moving results in the character sort of sliding past them while spinning around, which is a really bizarre look. There's some bugs with the dialogue system where the dialogue seems to lose synchronization if you perform some actions too soon, such as trying to take the sword before talking to Caden, which results in him acting like you've already spoken. Same thing if you manage to get past the gate with Diego before talking to Ori, who also acts like you've already spoken to him, even if you haven't. The conversation with Saris gives you choices on which topics to follow, but choosing them out of a certain order makes it sound like the nameless hero is always forgetting the topic. Some of the parting dialogues with NPCs makes no sense depending on which dialogues you ended with, or if you left without choosing any dialogues whatsoever. It's really weird to see prompts to talk to NPCs show up over their head, considering you can't actually speak to them until you get close enough for a second prompt to show up at the bottom. Another visually distracting issue is the highlights on loot and interactive objects, which are especially annoying considering they also have floating arrows over them as well, and show up with a text prompt to interact with them when you get near. I understand that they might think there's a need for a highlight system given the density of the foliage and the number of things that you have to see and interact with, but really I think the players should be expected to keep their own eyes open, and I don't think it's necessary when we already have text that shows up over the items to tell you when you're near enough to pick something up anyway. Ironically, the highlights over meat bugs are bugged, and they can often be seen even from miles away, even through parts of the environment or through the characters themselves. There's some confusing indicators on the UI, such as enemy health, which seems like it has a number of bars based on how many hits it takes to kill them, which in practice seem to reflect how many normal hits it would take to kill a given enemy with the best weapon that you have, not the one you currently have equipped. And the same bars on the hero's health bar don't really seem to indicate anything in particular. It showed no difference depending on who you're fighting and how much damage they could deal. Anytime you load a save game currently, it results in a new number of previous pop-ups reoccurring and causing a lot of noise in the loading screen. And from almost any part of the map that you load into, you can hear the loot player by the gate for a second or two. I found that picking up certain random items will cause previous quest updates to trigger again for some reason after reloading the game, even if they have nothing to do with the quest. It seems like audio for things like waterfalls are just straight up missing, or the developers just couldn't be bothered with putting them in. I mean, the waterfall by the exchange place, for example, should be absolutely deafening, even at that distance. As it is right now, there's no ability to load a save file from in-game. You have to quit to the main menu for some reason. There's a lot to go over in terms of gameplay, so I'll kind of keep combat on its own thing right now. But when it comes to hostile enemies, I found that they hardly move from their home position. If you run more than a few yards away, they just leash and turn around. And I could not lead any monsters to NPCs to see if they would even fight them. In fact, Diego conveniently, when he was walking, seemed to stay well away from any potential fight when he moves, and monsters will leash well before they get near him if you try to lure them towards him. NPCs also tend to leash pretty quickly and do not remain hostile once they put their weapon away, with one exception. And given that exception, it's very annoying to have discovered that NPCs will heal to full health when you beat them. So it seems like the developers really didn't want you killing people in the demo. Diego, meanwhile, is not hostile at all, and you're forced to keep your weapon away when you're near him. You can't even draw it to fight anybody else. On that subject, as it is right now, there's no ability to just knock people down in this game. Taking any NPCs down to 0 health simply results in them recovering immediately, and if they knock you down to full health, well, you're dead. As far as fighting monsters, this is one of the few games where I feel like it has somewhat believable wolf behavior, as they tend to keep a distance and leap on you to gnaw at you for damage. Luckily, this is done without an obnoxious QTE, but I think it beats a lot of the more typical video game wolves that just stand in your face and start taking bites out of you. Unfortunately, in general, the monsters seem to lack the pack mentality that a lot of the original Gothic games had, which makes it easier to fight single wolves and scavengers without fear of aggroing the rest of them. In general, I found the monsters and the NPCs on that matter to be typically very timid and not aggressive, which makes more sense for humans, I suppose, who focus on technique, but less so on wolves, who you would think would be more inclined to rush and tear you to shreds. But even when they're fighting in groups, they don't seem to be particularly aggressive in general, even when they have the upper hand on you. It seems like sneaking up on monsters is possible when they're sleeping, because the only monsters I was able to do it to were the wolves themselves. And this was actually a mechanic in the original game, very specifically taught to you, although the awakened animals seem to move around enough that they typically see you. Not a fan of how opening the inventory pauses the game, which is a very typical game mechanic, but in my opinion, I always respected how the Gothic games wouldn't do that, and even how Elex returned to it in the end. In my opinion, it just gives the player an easy out to just pause the game, throw down a few potions to get back to full health, and just have no consequence for it. The UI in general seems like it's built for consoles, and it's really frustrating to manage with the mouse and keyboard, especially since the mouse only seems to actually operate in the radial menu for quick access items, which also pauses the game. And it does not work well with the mouse cursor at all. It often just seems to ignore inputs. The tutorial itself is annoyingly obtuse. It pauses the game and has to explain every single detail, even the ones you could easily figure out yourself, such as how to use a cooking pot. And even the nameless hero himself, just in random comments he makes while exploring, feels compelled to point out landmarks as part of quests rather than let you figure it out for yourself. The consumables in the game do not seem very well balanced, and in fact are quite confusing. Blueberries, for some reason, seem to offer more of a healing effect than anything else, and healing potions themselves offer an HP bonus rather than any actual restoration. It is possible to stack buffs from consumables up to 6 for the same type, such as having 6 buffs for hit points and 6 buffs for stamina. Rotten meat as an item is supposedly useful as bait for distracting monsters, but personally I could not get it to work at all. I have no idea if it's meant to be used to distract beasts from pursuing you, or to catch the attention of unaware animals so you can sneak up on them, but either way I could not get it to work. Right now there's no ability to swim in the game, and in fact the sources of water are all boundaried by invisible walls. I was able to use cheats to get past them, and this simply showed that the water is intangible and the character simply walks on the bottom of the river unhindered. It's likely that this is going to change, but whether or not they will include swimming or simply have your character drown currently is unknown. Climbing the environment is highly restricted in this demo, at least, and it is very obvious where you can do it. It's frustratingly identical to Risen 2 and 3, where the locations you could climb were a sheer 90-degree angle and were very obvious. And basically, you need to cram your face into the wall that you want to climb in order to get the prompt to climb it. While playing around with cheats to gain hit points, I found that fall damage seems to be a percent of your total health and not a quantity. The same fall would do about 45% of health whether I had 100 hit points or 100,000. And on that note, the debug mode is available in this game and is performed the same way you used to by typing the name Marvin in the character menu. This time around it's not nearly as full featured as it was in the older games, but it does have some neat options such as teleporting, unlocking a free camera, giving yourself HP, and even possessing NPCs, which unfortunately seems really broken. Now getting into combat more specifically, the combat system is based on your character's stance. You use the mouse to redirect your position into 3 different stances in order to defend yourself and attack from 3 different directions. The defense mechanic is based on mirroring your opponent's stance to automatically block their hits. All of your actions are limited by stamina, including blocking, dodging, and attacking. The stamina pool in this demo seems way more generous than it is in most games with a stamina meter, such as Dark Souls or even Elex. The recovery seems to be a lot slower by consequence, however, so it's more of a battle of attrition in some ways. Going negative in your stamina on any action will cause your character to just kind of stop moving and stand there catching his breath while giving your opponents a free chance to hit you. The combat is focused by a single target lock-on system and is pretty much dependent on it. And for that reason, I suspect group fights will be either frustratingly difficult since you can't rapidly switch targets, or otherwise the enemies will be incredibly timid as a consequence of it. And really the latter seems to be the case, as any occasion where I was fighting 2 NPCs, it resulted in only one NPC really ever taking a swing every so often. And it almost seemed like they would switch which one was in the lead, and the other one would just stay back for a while. The backup opponent will actually often recoil every time the one you're focused on takes or blocks a hit, which is strange. Unfortunately, I've found that oftentimes if one opponent is standing behind the other, the one in back seems capable of blocking a hit that would have hit the one in front, which means the hit detection for these blocks is obviously really unreasonably wide to be able to allow this. Trying to switch targets with the lock-on is really clunky. It's bound to the Alt key by default, and even if it can be rebound, it's still really awkward because you cannot choose the direction that it switches targets in. So if you're fighting more than 2 enemies, if there's one you're trying to focus on, it's going to take it typically 2 button presses to try and change your lock-on to it. I really could not determine if it was possible to hit more than one enemy with a single swing, whether you're locked on or not. So far, I have not been able to make that happen. It really does feel like the stances are meaningless for attacking. The whole point just seems to be to mirror your opponent's swings in order to parry them. Your opponents don't seem to have any difficulty switching their stance on the fly to block your swings. In a way, it almost seemed like your chance to hit was just RNG based on whether or not the enemy wanted to defend. In a lot of cases, I found just spamming the light attacks would result in the enemy just sort of dropping their guard and taking a hit, almost like they just gave up on defending themselves. All the attacks are outrageously telegraphed in this game, which seems unnecessary if there are prompts on the screen already, but also just makes the combat in general feel really slow, sluggish, and not satisfying in any regard. And coinciding with that, there's really intense recoil on all blocks. Every enemy who blocks or gets blocked bounces back like they just got blasted in the face with a gust of wind. That paired with the long recovery on successful parries and a dodge that really only seems effective in the middle frames means that none of these techniques really help at all with landing counterattacks. By the time you recover from any of them, your opponent is ready to defend himself again. The dodge direction is not really as predictable as it should be. In many cases, I've had the character step in one direction when I was moving him in the other. So directing your dodges is kind of a crapshoot. Simultaneously, I found that the distance of the quick step dodge seems really undependable. In some cases, he would only travel half the distance that he would in others, and it seemed like the environment got in the way a lot of times. On top of that, the input lag on the animation seems to vary quite significantly. I guess it's possible that the combat is slow and awkward by design, with the intention being that the player gets more skills to add variety to the combat. As it is right now, the AI itself might not have these skills simply because they haven't been developed yet. And really, it's pretty obvious that winning fights against all but one NPC in this demo is not intended, which is actually hilarious because there's one that becomes permanently hostile depending on things you do. Probably the most amusing thing I discovered is that unlocked combat against monsters makes them pretty much unable to defend themselves, as they're unable to dodge, and you can quite easily just chase them down and beat them to death. It's not an effective strategy against humans, since they are able to parry your swings, although it does make you more mobile at the cost of only being able to perform a single attack and have no ability to parry. Right now, it seems like all weapons available are just two-handed swords. Not really any indication if there are going to be other weapon types or how one-handed swords will perform. We see that Bloodwind holds a spear while he's idle, but it seems to disappear if you aggro him and he'll just draw his sword instead, so I have no idea if that spear is meant to be a functional weapon in the game. And there is no indication whatsoever what they're going to do with bows and magic. The only bow we see in the game is held by Diego, and he just uses it to shoot at rocks. When it comes to skills, we don't really see much on display of what they're going to do with it. The character sheet is pretty barren. It seems to suggest a fairly loyal attribute menu to the classic games. No sign of there being more specialized skills in combat, such as new techniques. We see that the 4 combat skills, with one-handed, two-handed bows and crossbows, all have distinct ranks, and not the 0 to 100% scale that we see in Gothic 2. They seem to be the same kind of 3-tiered rank system in the first Gothic. There's no obvious signs at what would change at higher ranks, if it would mean more combo attacks, faster attack speeds, different animations, or new techniques. All characters in the demo use the same attack techniques, all the same animations that are available to the player, so we don't really have any visual clues as to what the higher skill ranks will provide. There's 3 other skills that we see in the menu, sneaking, acrobatics, and magic, which all in this demo only say untrained, suggesting that there might only be a single rank in each of those. No sign of whether or not there are any magic circles like there were in Gothic 1 and 2. The lockpicking skill in this game had no minigame associated with it. There was simply a spinning circle and the character would open the chest. Your skill in the game, in the demo, is 100% by default, so there's no real indication of what the lower skills would mean. Presumably it would break the lockpicks, given that you find several in the game, but with 100% skill by default, we can't see what the consequences of failure are. There's no ability to level up in the demo, which is strange, because it is possible to go beyond the 2000 XP it says you need to level up. Nothing happens when you go beyond it, basically. And I must say that when you look at the character menu, the number of skills on display looks pretty sparse even compared to the original game. There's no sign of alchemy, no sign of magic circles, as we said before. Really no sign of anything other than the most basic skills of the first game. Now getting into the atmosphere side of things, which was one of the biggest bones of contention that the classic Gothic fans had with this game, there's really not much variety in the music as it stands. There's a single song that loops in the daytime exploration, and the same tune that plays every time you unsheath your weapon and enter combat. There's some hints of the classic Kai Rosenkranz melody in the outro of the demo, but in general, it's more original compositions, which honestly seem to take inspiration from the same kind of pseudo-Celtic sort of themes of the original of the Witcher franchise. The main menu theme has a pretty moody, sort of vaguely reminiscent impression of the original main menu screen, although it lacks any memorable melody, just a spooky cello and some trumpets and some plucked guitar strings, really. The battle music seemed like it really wanted to be in The Witcher, whereas the music that plays in the intro cutscene sounded like it could have fit well in Arcania. The intro to the demo seems virtually identical to the original, down to the narration being almost a word-for-word recreation of it, although with a much more stylized and poorly directed cutscene. It really offers no new insights into the background story or really into any of my questions on the point or expectations of the barrier itself, which is unfortunate. And instead the game chooses to open with an outrageously dramatic explosion of the lift that, in my opinion, could not be adequately explained. I have no idea why the lift would be attacked. Like, literally none of the camps in the valley stand to benefit from the lift's destruction. And I have to ask, what the hell was so explosive about a bunch of wooden beams and pulleys? Some people have tried to argue that was a raid from the new camp gone horribly wrong, but honestly, attacking the lift itself seems like an absolutely stupid idea. There's no sign of the attackers nearby, although there were plenty of corpses of old camp guards strewn about the place. I really cannot theorize any way this attack could have been related to the sleeper and still be believable. A friend of mine suggested that this might have been an attempt to explain why no more convicts appear in the colony after your arrival, although in my opinion this could have been corrected by actually introducing some new convicts and therefore getting rid of that sort of error. Quite honestly, I don't think anyone took umbrage with that in the first place, so it just seems like all of this was to add some drama and some Hollywood explosions to the introduction. The game decided to add a glossary of entries for characters, locations, and a bestiary, which make for a lot of lore potential, I suppose, but I'm worried that this may result in a lot of fluff and meaningless flavor text, and really not leave enough to player speculation or imagination. The current entries elaborate on characters in ways that you would just learn by talking and interacting with them in the older games, and I don't like the way it feels like it has the developer has a need to explain the characteristics of the people you meet as if you're not clever enough to interpret it yourself. There's much more detail on the item descriptions in that regard as well than any previous Gothic or Piranha games. It's almost like a Dark Souls type of flavor text on all the items that you find, although they're typically much more mundane and meaningless than that. In my opinion, there's just way too much fluff in the opening area. Given that this is just a demo, they might not intend it to stay this way, but it's also just kind of got that classic tutorial level vibe, where it's just kind of holding your hand throughout the whole thing and just slows you down for no good reason. I do enjoy the way the exchange place was expanded. It makes sense that the exchange place sort of has much bigger facilities to sort and receive all the goods that come in from the outside world. Although it does seem bizarre to me that the lift itself does not extend beyond the barrier like it's supposed to. In my opinion, the ruins that you encounter in the central area do not mesh with the area very well. It seems pretty silly to have an amphitheater in the middle of the road with a bunch of religious and demonic imagery and mosaics and bronze rings all over it for some reason. I will say the path by the abandoned mine was recreated very faithfully. I was kind of impressed when I saw that. Although it has the addition of a second gate down along the end of the path that Bloodwind guards, and the expanded plateau up above with an elevator and a watchtower at the peak of it. In my opinion, it's really odd that the nameless hero does not recognize snappers, given that the previous games established that they inhabit pretty much all of Corinthus and the mainland. It kind of reminds me how the original game treated swampweed like it was a unique herb to the colony, but by Gothic 2 and 3, it becomes pretty clear that it's widespread, available all over the continent, essentially. There's several characters in this demo who refer to a black market, which sounds pretty silly to me, given that the colony is inhabited by nothing but criminals, so essentially the whole thing would be a black market in my opinion, but I guess this is meant to refer to the goods stolen from the ore barons by people who work for the old camp and sell it as contraband to some of the other camps under the table, but just calling it a black market when it's already a society of nothing but criminals seems a bit silly. So when it comes to the story, I guess it stands to reason, quite honestly, that this game is going to deviate a lot from the story that we're familiar with, given that much of its target audience already knows the story by heart. And I'm sure that this will be the sticking point of a reboot for everyone, since it's going to be very hard to satisfy people who come in with strong predeterminations. So this is kind of where I'm on the fence, and I don't expect a good outcome out of it, quite honestly. When it comes to the characters and the dialogue in the game, honestly, this might be sort of personal bias of mine, but to me, the use of American voice actors in the original games, while it may have been down to budget constraints or something with the localization studio that they used, it really created a more unique atmosphere to the Gothic games that a lot of fantasy games just don't have, using typical British voice talents that just sound more traditional Tolkien-esque type of fantasy world. There's something just, to me, special about hearing men with swords with their southern drawls, or Iberians, sort of Baptist evangelist kind of comparisons that you can make, or even with the fire mages in the second game. So I think the loss of that kind of voice talent just seems put a damper in the atmosphere. Obviously, none of this really applies to the international audiences who didn't hear the English localization, but to me, that was a big part of what made these games special. It does stand to reason that a lot of the voice acting is just a placeholder, and that the actors will be replaced if this game sees full development, akin to how a pilot episode for a TV series might not necessarily recast the roles to the same actors. In general, it seems like a lot of the voice acting is low quality and almost seems like it wasn't recorded in the studio. There's a lot of clipping errors that you would not expect from a professional recording and stuff like that. It's unlikely that any of this will make the final cut, and a cursory glance at the credits, at the voice credits, revealed a bunch of actors who seem to mostly do voiceover roles for TV adverts, so I cannot imagine that these are going to be the final cast for the game. But nevertheless, I feel compelled to offer my critique of their performances simply to make sure that the developers do not proceed with the same direction they seem to have given these fellows. The nameless hero in particular sounds like an absolute dumbass. I cannot stand him. His weird Cockney voice aside, his dialogues just make him completely unlikable to me. Everything from cocky, foolhardy, to dim-witted and oblivious. Parts of his personality that were left to the player in the original game are just sort of assumed in these dialogues. Like, In the original Gothic, you could be snarky, smartass, and piss people off, or just staying meek and friendly and quiet, and you really got to deal with all the outcomes of that. Instead, in this demo, the hero just kind of speaks for himself. He's constantly mouthing off at people without anything witty to say, taunting people for no good reason.
I can defend myself better than you think. Trust me. An old camp soldier in debt to the new camp. Strange, isn't it? It was enough to slay a huge wolf and a killer snapper, and all with this crappy sword.
And in the intro, just really seems to talk to himself way too much.
Right. I'll leave it here for a moment. Worst prison ever. Come on, my pretty.
His sharp facial features and his weird rapey smirk make him a lot less enjoyable a character to play as than the really kind of dopey, friendly-looking Mike Hoga doppelganger of the original game. And his meaningless tattoos that they suddenly decided to give him kind of break from his everyman appeal, since tattoos by nature have some kind of personal significance. It's not likely that we'll ever know what they'll symbolize, nor should we, because that's kind of the whole point of the Nameless Hero. He's not meant to have a history, and especially some of his lines in the intro also kind of spoil that illusion for you. His idle banter when he's coming down the lift suggests that he was part of a group of thieves and got caught in a heist, which already gives him more history than the original franchise ever did. And it kind of spoils our ability to kind of fill the role for him. He was never a typical sort of blank slate character that you get in games like Elder Scrolls, where you get to develop your own, but he's still meant to kind of start from nothing when he enters the colony, and you can fill in the blanks yourself and sort of develop his personality how you wish. Giving him any kind of history really prevents us from being able to imagine the type of character that we think he is, such as, some people might have thought maybe he was framed or falsely imprisoned. Anybody could imagine what his crime was. Instead, we're told, yeah, he was a petty thief, a burglar probably. And that's really kind of spoils his characterization for me. The first game only ever told us that he was in a jail cell for a month before being sent to the colony, and it lends more believability to the idea that he's so unfamiliar with the areas that he encounters in the later games, since we have no idea where he's come from. Moving on to Diego, I must say he's an even more aggravating character than the hero himself is. Classically, Diego was a bit aloof at first. He spoke in very matter-of-fact terms, but he would help you quite generously as long as you stuck by him. This Diego, on the other hand, speaks with a lot of embellishment. He acts very puffed up and theatrical, and when he talks, he has these uncomfortable pauses for no reason, and just has a tendency to sit there and just stare at you.
My name is Diego, and I'm the leader of the shadows in the old camp.
Most annoying is how many of his lines are just such obvious statements that he speaks like they're really clever observations, such as when he describes Bloodwind's sort of money-grubbing, extortionist kind of personality. His introduction to the player makes him seem like a really theatric, heroic kind of guy, embracing the idea of mentoring this one random rookie, which does not really suit his personality, or the personality that we got from him in the original game. And it's difficult to explain kind of what got under my skin in this scene, but the way he silenced the Nameless Hero from giving his name during their opening dialogues, then proceeded to give him a nickname anyway, really clashes kind of with that overbearing interest he seemed to have in interacting with the hero, while still trying to pretend that he doesn't actually give a shit. It made no sense to me whatsoever.
By the way, we haven't been introduced. Yeah, that's not important. I'm gonna call you Rookie. All right with you?
In the original game, he cut him off really quickly because he was making a point that he doesn't really give a shit who you are. His job is there to advise you to join him, but he doesn't care if you do or not. So in my opinion, his sort of overbearing intention to be a mentor and a friend to the Nameless Hero really does not blend with his personality from the original game. Strangely, we get to meet Bloodwind in this intro, even though we would not normally encounter him until we reach the old camp. And in my opinion, his entire personality is completely wasted here. Instead of his original introduction, where he's acting all sleazy and pushy, trying to get you to pay for his services, He's weirdly polite other than making some disparaging remarks about the hero when he sees him, instead of vaguely suggesting that the player should use his protective services. He just outright says it in sort of the most unenthusiastic voice.
Take this, and remember, you can always come to me at the old camp.
Well, that's very generous of you.
Not generous, smart. If you need protection, I can provide it, for a small price. As long as you can afford it, of course.
And him and Diego both just seem to beat you over the head with his character archetype rather than let you kind of put that together on your own.
Yeah. Bloodwind doesn't lift a finger if there's no ore involved. That's his philosophy, isn't it?
More or less.
Speaking of which, Diego's apparent friendship with so many characters in this game seems really bizarre, given that he never really interacted with them or talked about them much in the original game. We know he obviously dealt with Thoris and a handful of shadows, but none of those acquaintances really seem to border on friendship, and certainly were not strong enough to prevent them betraying him later. For me, it seemed to get really grating how the nameless hero was immediately pushy about Diego's past and his history, and the walking conversations that they have expose some details that originally we didn't learn until Gothic 2. Now, admittedly, a lot of Diego's history probably was not even imagined by Piranovites until they got to Gothic 2, but to me, it spoils sort of one of my favorite lines from the second game, as well as one of the more satisfying quest conclusions when it comes to Mr. Gerbrandt, sir.
You never told me about that.
You never asked me.
We meet Ori once again, the guard of the gateway to the exchange place, who originally was just an old, idle, mild-mannered guard in the original, who had some tips and advice to offer you, but in this game has been reimagined and sort of fleshed out as an alcoholic swordsman who has a few quests to offer you. He still offers some of the same insights they had in the first game, but he also has a bit more personality on his own, and I don't necessarily object to it.
What? Eddie, the supplies from the king gone? Gomez is gonna kill us! But of course, it's all the same to you, isn't it? The important thing is to play that cursed loop day and night!
It is nice, in my opinion, that characters who don't have any more dialogue topics have more idle responses recorded for them than they did in pretty much any Piranovites game, such as in Gothic 3, where they would simply shout, "Leave me alone," or in Elex when they would just go, "Nah." One thing that does get aggravating to me is how some of the dialogues, especially between the hero and Diego, just seem to blatantly ignore things that actually happen, such as when the hero at some point seems to completely disregard that Diego saved his life, and Diego seems to make no effort to dispute that. Now, there are a few new NPCs who were introduced in this game that did not exist in the original Gothic, which come in the form of Caden and Saris, two old camp guards who use their duties in the camp to cover a lot of their criminal mischief. Caden very obviously fits a sort of sleazy, double-crossing character archetype, whereas Saris actually turns out to be quite friendly once you got a sword to his throat, of course, assuming you choose to spare him. And I would actually say Saris has the best vocal performance in this demo overall, to the point where I would almost enjoy having him show up in the final game.
From Caden, that's all. What's so funny?
Do you really believe that son of a bitch's story? A pendant we stole from Caden? Look, boy, he sold you a pup.
And the characters of Caden and Saris actually offer the most in-depth quest in this demo, which is actually surprisingly detailed and has quite a few different outcomes based on the player's actions, and leaves a lot of things open-ended for consequences, presumably later on in the game. There's numerous outcomes based on your action and, in fact, the order in which you complete certain things. While it is more exciting than any of the other quests in the intro, it ultimately is pretty obvious what you need to do in order to get the best outcome and still pocket the best rewards. The rest of the quests that are in the demo are just a bunch of absolutely nonsense busy work, such as Diego won't help you leave until you find a sword, Ori won't let you through the gate even if you do him a favor, and once you're through, Bloodwind stops and makes you do 2 more of these get these things and kill these things kind of quests. Overall, the amount of busy work and quests just to get going in the world is at odds with the much more open and free-flowing intro of the first Gothic, which really didn't slow you down in any way on your way to the old camp or to explore the rest of the world. It's funny to me that the character Saris asks for medicine once he's wounded, but the hero can only provide him with a selection of random wild berries, and won't even offer him a healing potion if you find one. A lot of the conversations and quest outcomes in this demo resulted in very overt prompts saying, so-and-so will remember this, which may have made sense in Telltale games, but honestly, in a game like this, it's just completely overbearing and devoid of any subtlety that you would expect players to be able to kind of interpret the follow of lying or cheating characters on their own. And again, it really just gives me the impression that the developers have no faith in the ability of players to sort of read between the lines and really understand the consequences of your actions in the game, unless something overtly tells you whether or not you did something right or wrong. So this all has been a lot of chat, and I apologize if a lot of it is sort of disorganized and unstructured. So I'll try and end this just by summarizing my thoughts in general. I'm not a fan of the atmosphere of the game when it comes to the introduction, when it comes to the portrayal of a lot of characters, and especially when it comes to the music, which I find pretty weak, generic, not nearly as subtle or moody as any of Kai Rosenkranz's classic themes. And I really hope they don't make the Gothic 3 mistake of only having one really bombastic combat theme that plays every time you get in a fight. Ideally, they'll go the Risen route of having remixes of the current exploration theme instead. It seems like the story intends to stick to the original, at least for the introduction, but then for some reason everything decided to start exploding and nothing made sense anymore. I'm afraid of how they will deviate from the plot, although I do respect the fact that doing the same thing over again will just bore everyone who played it. But I'm just worried that it's going to end up going off the rails in their desire to surprise all of us. I am sincerely hoping that the intro of the game, of the full game, will allow you much more freedom in the beginning instead of just sort of funneling you down this long tutorial of busy work and nonsense just to get going. In my opinion, the replayability of games suffer intensely from these kind of bloated intros, even when they're optional, because you feel compelled to complete them anyway for the rewards and XP, and they just get outrageously repetitive every time you want to restart the game. In Gothic 1, it just lets you walk straight to the old camp or start exploring with nobody stopping you for nonsense bullshit quests on the way, and in my opinion made it much more enjoyable to get started. I will admit, despite Gothic 2 committing this crime, I've never criticized it for it, simply because the hike to town and everything you do on the way just feels like it fits the atmosphere so much more better. This, meanwhile, is just a bunch of random characters asking for stupid favors. More than anything, I think I'm hoping that the game just reduces the amount of hand-holding that it does in this demo. Maybe leave some of it behind in options in the game menu for players to turn on, but just have them off by default. It just seems like the developers are so unwilling to let you look for things or solve quests on your own without intrusive heads up or just overtly telling you the outcome. This might be a more trivial personal gripe, but I dislike games that make a lot of magic items available in the intro, such as rings and amulets like we have here. Gothic 1 never did that, and it made them seem it made it seem like much more of an achievement or a discovery when you finally got one. Whereas games like this make magic items in general just seem so much more mundane. Combat needs a lot of work. In my opinion, it's just way too slow. The lack of options make it feel like a tedious slog rather than an exciting, engaging fight to the death. I'm not a fan of the locked-on combat in general. This is not a mechanic that appeals to me in any way. While I enjoy games like Dark Souls that allow you the option of locking on, it's still really frustrating when games focus around their locked-on systems such as this and just don't allow any kind of free-flowing combat whatsoever. If they insist on keeping the same combat system, it's absolutely essential that they add a lot more skill and variety and different techniques for you to engage with and learn, or otherwise combat will, in my opinion, be the least satisfying part of the entire game and probably just take up way too much of it. Hopefully they'll come up with methods to make it easier to switch targets and different things to make the combat feel more active in general, such as getting rid of the automatic blocking system, and just more diverse skills to defend yourself and counterattack and that kind of thing. For starters, at least make heavy attacks more useful. Hopefully they'll consider more diversity when it comes to different weapon types, at least between one- and two-handed weapons, but also ideally between swords, axes, spears, maces, and that kind of thing. For example, let's say maces deal the most damage with overhead attacks, spears deal most damage with thrusts, and axes maybe can cripple limbs to make enemies less mobile or to weaken their attack power or something like that. Just anything like that. We really just cannot end up with a combat system where it's just a one-trick pony like this. Quite honestly, I just wish a Gothic game, a Piranha Bytes, or a Piranha Bytes game, for that matter, would realize the potential of the combat systems that they had in Gothic 2 or in Risen, which were much more active and exciting, and in my opinion, much more engaging, and the only thing they were lacking was some polish and some variety in the techniques. Probably the worst sin committed by this is simply this, the fact that none of the characters are recognizable to the ones that we enjoyed in the original game. And if you're going to reboot a franchise, you cannot just completely overhaul everything we knew and loved about it. And part of that were just the characters. And sure, there was not a lot of character development in the original games, but they still had a lot of personality that just all of us kind of grew attached to. And in this case, none of the characters are recognizable, nor even a likable reimagination of their original selves. Any attempts to flesh out their mannerisms and their personalities in this demo just resulted sort of in an over-reliance on tropes and bad script writing. A lot of Gothic's charm is just that the characters themselves tended to have more simple motivations. They weren't necessarily deep, complex, and didn't just get lost in a lot of this meaningless conversation. There wasn't an emphasis on their relationships. It was just all these characters sort of bonding over their mutual adventures and challenges together, rather than having these deep, complicated, Hollywood-style origin stories with each other. I'm really hoping to see a lot of variety beyond the skills in what the original game provided, because so far it just seems like this game is not even going to make it that far. Now, I have been told that the developers have seen and responded to a lot of the criticism. Haven't been able to see these comments myself, but supposedly they have identified the 3 areas of the game that received the highest criticism, which include the combat, the atmosphere, and more specifically, the lack of bullet in the intro. Basically, it seems like everyone has kind of the same complaint I have, which is that Bullet and his punch to the face got replaced by explosions and snappers. Again, I couldn't really find any of these statements myself. The only responses I've seen from the developer or the publisher in any regard were from a character named Ziddy on the Steam forums and on Discord, whose profile identifies them as a community manager for Black Forest Games, which is a subsidiary of THQ Nordic, and it seems like they're also standing in, at least for now, as a community manager for some of the other THQ Nordic titles. Unfortunately, Ziddy was not able to offer any real specific insight into the thoughts and responses of THQ Barcelona to the feedback for this game, but hopefully we hear something soon on how exactly they plan to take this in a different direction. And seriously, get the hero to see a doctor. That looks like it burns.
All right. Oh, God damn it.